Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this special Tergar International program, My Meditation Journey with Susan Kaiser Greenland, in conversation with Cortland Dahl. My name is Beth Korchinski. I'm a Tergar staff member, and on behalf of my colleagues Jiva and Eberhard, working in the background, thank you so much for joining us. Our program today is being streamed on YouTube, and the YouTube chat is available to say hello, tell us where you're from, etc. We will have some time for questions at the end of our interview today. So if you do have any questions for Susan, please use the QR code and the link that you see on your screen right now. You can scan that QR code in advance to have it handy, but we'll also post that link periodically in the YouTube chat. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome Tergar Executive Director and Instructor Cortland Dahl to introduce our guest, Susan. Hi, Cortland.
Thank you so much, Beth, and hello, everyone. An honor to be here with all of you and to welcome our guest, who is a dear friend of mine and many of ours in the Tergar community, Susan Kaiser Greenland. And it's something we've been looking forward to for a long time, to celebrate her new book, Real World Enlightenment, and all the many things she is doing in the world, and just to share a little bit of dialogue and her insights with all of you. So I thought I'd actually start this introduction in a somewhat unconventional way by sharing how I got to know Susan, which reflects the enormous influence that she's having in the world. So I first became aware of Susan and her work in 2010. My son was just starting kindergarten, and I was really feeling like the education he was getting was missing all of these inner components, the inner journey that we learn through meditation. And so I looked around to see what I could find. And what I found actually was Susan's work. There was not much happening back in 2010. This was before mindfulness had exploded onto the scene. And I came across her book, The Mindful Child. I devoured it. I was so inspired by it. I immediately bought other copies and I gave them to teachers at the school where my son had just started kindergarten. And I was immediately so touched by her work. And it was so helpful, actually, to my own journey as a parent, to the teachers who were teaching my son and the other kids at the school. So that is how I got to know Susan. And it just shows that she was really the pioneer about bringing mindfulness, meditation, and these inner qualities like attention, compassion, wisdom, and so on to families and to children. So she has done amazing work. She is an author. She, of course, wrote The Mindful Child, Mindful Games. She, of course, we're here to talk about Real World Enlightenment, her newest book, which just came out a few months ago, and I would highly, highly recommend. And she has also created some of the most pioneering programs to teach parents and children to meditate. So actually the work that I've been involved with at UW-Madison, where we do research on meditation and mindfulness programs, we for many years have looked to Susan and her work for a lot of the work that we've done in schools, and she's been an important advisor to us and a mentor over the years. And she's done many other things as well. She's featured on some of the most well-known meditation apps like 10% Happier, Insight Timer. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, CNN, Washington Post, all over some of the biggest media channels. And beyond that, you'd think that she was doing this her entire life, but actually she had a really successful career as a lawyer in the entertainment industry in both New York and especially Los Angeles for many, many years prior to all of the work that she's done as a pioneer with mindfulness and meditation in the modern world. So, Susan, we are so honored to have you with us. It's something, as I said, we've been looking forward to for a long time. So I'm actually not seeing Susan. Is Susan on the screen here? Oh, there we go. Susan, there you are. I was hoping
Hey,
my
Court.
tech was not
Thank you for that
malfunctioning.
wonderful introduction. What it really just tells you is how old I am, though, It's like it's the great thing about being a pioneer is you've been around for a while.
Well, you have done amazing, amazing work. I know you've been an inspiration to so many of us. So I thought we could just dive straight into the deep end. I kind of mentioned your book and this idea of real world enlightenment, and it's something when we first start practicing meditation, you hear these words thrown around like awakening and enlightenment, and it's very far out, esoteric sounding stuff. And it feels like something that might happen if we move to the Himalayas and live in a cave for 50 years or something like that. And you're presenting something that is much more attainable, something that we can taste even in our busy, complex modern lives. So I wonder if you could maybe just share with us how you think about this, why you chose this as the theme for your new book, and how this actually can be something that is actually accessible to us who might not be full-time meditators living in far off places.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, the reason I chose it is because I've seen this kind of transformation myself. I've experienced it myself, and I've also seen it in countless people I've worked with over the years. And the people who tend to come to me are to look for some sort of support are caregivers.
Mm,
And caregivers tend to be incredibly busy people. And if you ask them, and they come because they want to help the children in their lives, whether they're teachers or clinicians or parents. And so they're hoping that we can help the kids and they can get on with their work, right? So they've got so much to do that they're just hoping that they don't actually have to sit down and meditate. So when we tell them, it's really helpful if the whole system practices, and if you practice, you will actually embody something that the kids will pick up. We get a different kind of resistance with caregivers than we might get with other people who come for this type of instruction or this type of practice. The resistance we get from caregivers is often, this seems very self-indulgent to me.
mm,
My time would be better spent working or doing chores or actually being with my children than taking time off on my own. So we really need to help them understand that ripple effect of this practice, and that if we become just a little less neurotic, a little less reactive, a little more open, that will have an effect on our kids. And one of the things that has happened over the years is many, many parents and caregivers have come in and they've tried to meditate, but they haven't been able to get over the idea of needing to sit cross-legged on a cushion for
mm,
extended periods of time. So much like Rinpoche's anytime, anywhere practice, this idea of dropping brief moments of awareness into your day and really focusing on the small things that you do and say every day is something that has been really an important shift for people. So that's why this book is kind of the last piece of the program that I wrote, because it focuses on these universal themes or golden threads that cut across all wisdom traditions that lead to a wiser and more compassionate life.
Yeah, so I'd love to dive into that idea of golden threads a little bit. What does that have to do with awakening, enlightenment, and especially the idea that that could be something that we experience right now and right here, not again some esoteric concept.
Well, for people who are familiar with Buddhist teachings and with Buddhist kind of methodology, we think of view, meditation, application, and the
Mhm.
golden threads are the view.
Okay. And actually, that reminds me of another topic you and I have discussed, which is that the way mindfulness is often framed in the modern world is very much just like being attentive to what's going on in the moment. And of course, that's an important part of mindfulness. But in the traditional context, the word mindfulness means much more than that, and it's very much pointing to what you're talking about. It has this sense not simply bringing yourself back to the present moment, but bringing yourself back to what you just mentioned as the view. It's actually the word literally in Tibetan means to remember. It's actually the same word that's used when you think you just remember something. So maybe could you say a little bit about that when we talk about the view, some of the golden threads that you mentioned in your book? What is it that we're bringing ourselves back to in that moment where, like, even right now, we're talking, people are listening, and you bring yourself back to the present moment, and then you're bringing online this whole way of seeing things. What what would you say about that? What is it that we're reconnecting with?
Yeah, well, I'd like to start with the last piece first, which is the idea of the oldest definition. I believe it's the oldest definition of mindfulness is to remember. Um, and I love that. And I love it when working with kids and with caregivers and with anybody because it's very different from an affirmation. I am going to be mindful. I am going to remember. And it's very different from anything that where we beat ourselves up. We're
Hmm.
going to try to remember to do this. We're going to try to remember to integrate that. And that gives us more of the kind of water-like, more of the flowing quality of of a, of a way of approaching the kind of practice that I think what Rinpoche might call anytime, anywhere practice, this sort of thing. As far as what we're trying to remember, the golden threads, we really start with the very basics. Like in Rinpoche's model, it is awareness, love and compassion, wisdom, and joy. Now, remember, I work with the Tergar schools where we're integrating joy more deliberately because they're kids, so of course we're going to. So awareness, love and compassion, wisdom, joy, or what we talk about in the Inner Kids program is attention, balance, compassion, and playfulness.
Hmm.
So that's the first layer. But the next layer, and these are the themes that you really do find in many, if not all, of the wisdom traditions, are things like we're all interconnected, where
Hmm.
things are constantly changing, things are made up of multiple parts and pieces. And if you're a student of Rinpoche, you've heard this all many, many times. And then we go a little bit deeper to things like what's yearning about, what's renunciation about, what's discernment about. And these type understanding first on a conceptual level and then on a visceral level, those kind of shifts are things that people can drop into their daily life without having to go sit on a cushion on a mountaintop. And they do start to see how that helps them to reframe their perspective. So, again, like one of the things that we've always talked about view, meditation, application, the application. It's really not on the cushion. It's in the little things we do every day. And that, sometimes kind of messy. And we can't always just be in a messy situation and sit down and like take a 20-minute break and meditate, but we can remember, we can
Hmm.
remind ourselves that everything is changing. We can remind ourselves of the fact that we can't possibly know all the causes and conditions that led up to this moment. A really important theme for us to be remembering right now at this time. And those are the kind of themes that we can really remember in the midst of our daily life that can help us live in this more mindful way, this wiser and compassionate way.
Hmm. Hmm. I love that. And it reminds me of when I first met Mingyur Rinpoche and encountered some of the same ideas that you teach in your work, especially this idea that it's right here. It's not some altered state of consciousness, or you need to lock yourself in a room and go super, super deep into your mind, but it's just suddenly bringing online this new perspective that you can do literally anytime, anywhere, as you were mentioning. So just as a kind of a little experiment here. We're all doing this thing we all do many times every day. People are staring at their phones or looking at a computer screen. You and I are on Zoom, right? We're kind of talking mediated through technologies as we do many, many times every single day. So what does it look like? I mean, what does that actually mean in a moment like this, where it's not other than our life, it's actually taking what we actually do in our lives, but shifting it in a significant way that just changes our experience. So what are some ways we can actually do that in a practical sense?
Well, the very simple ways, if you're looking at more of the practice as opposed to the view piece, is, for example, right now we're on a Zoom meeting, right? And so I am aware that my nervous system is a little bit more stimulated than it would be if I was generally having my morning cup of coffee. And so to stay grounded, while I'm talking to you, I'm paying very close attention to the sole of the bottom of one foot, which is pushing against a meditation cushion. And that does have a way of down regulating. So even when you're on a Zoom meeting like this, you can move you can I don't want to say move your attention because you're not going to like forget what's going on in the move. You can on in a Zoom, can expand your attention to include more and to do that in a way that's grounding. So, but let's say Court, you said something that triggered me right now, which you haven't, but let's just say you did. We're on a Zoom meeting
I'll
and
try
you
to think
triggered
of
me.
something. We'll see if I can come up with
Nah,
something.
we're still young, so we may get
There's
there.
still room. There's lots of opportunities left.
Yeah, but for right now, you haven't. So one of the things that I could drop in at that moment is I would notice my arousal coming up. I wouldn't like pretend it wasn't happening in my mind. I wouldn't beat myself up for it. This is a natural thing. So I would notice my arousal. And then I would try to expand my perspective. And then there's a couple golden threads that work really well there. One is appreciation. When we are feeling uh somehow our mindset is a little bit different than where we really aspire it to be when we are moving away from the kinder, more open-minded, more compassionate mindset into a more closed one, from an expansive one to a closed one. It's very helpful to acknowledge what is causing that, and at the same time broaden our perspective to think of a few things that we're grateful for. Or in the same way, if you were to say to me something that was completely the opposite of what my point of view is, which I don't know that that has ever happened, and we've known each other a long time, but let's say you did. Um, Instead of being reactive, I would again ground myself, recognize that my system was, getting a little bit more heightened, and I would do my best to ground myself. But even if I couldn't completely ground myself, I would try to, before responding, think of what are a few things that might have happened to him or his perspective that might make it so different than mine. So trying to use these moments to bring in these ideas of the difference of cause and connection and karma and all of that makes us all have a little bit different way of seeing the world. So is that
Yeah,
responsive?
yeah. And it reminds me of, from a scientific perspective, there's exactly what you just said is a lot of what the science is showing as well, which is it's not as though, for example, if you practice these kinds of teachings that you're mentioning in a moment of emotional reactivity, it's not as though you're necessarily taking the reactivity or the response offline. It's not as though you're necessarily eliminating it. Rather, you're bringing online a whole other set of brain networks that help you to relate to that in a very different way. So, for example, we did this research with the pain network in the brain. And what we found is that advanced meditators actually experience the pain and the response to it more intensely than non-meditators. But what's different is there's this whole constellation of brain activity that's coming along with that. For example, just as you mentioned, if you bring awareness to the sensations in your body as you're having the reaction, as you mentioned, you're activating the salience network, you're activating the executive network. So it's not as though the reaction needs to stop, but you're bringing on all these other inner resources. And it goes to show that one of the things we often think we need to do in meditation is to stop feeling what we're feeling. Like if meditation works, whatever that might be, we somehow don't have the reaction anymore. But actually, this is saying something totally different than that. It's more about the relationship and kind of surrounding that with awareness and care rather than just taking it offline altogether.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I love that you're doing the research that's actually making sense of these ancient practices, because these are not practices that we made up. These are practices that we are simply translating. I know you've been a translator for a long time, and I view my work more as translation, translating for a modern world. But I do think that point that you make about not trying to reverse or shut off the emotional reaction is extremely important, because that's just where we can kind of get in. It's a bit of a fool's game, and we know that
Yeah.
from Mingyur Rinpoche's teaching about pizza. What do you want to try not to think about pizza? What's going to happen? You're going to think about a lot of pizza. So we don't want to stop that emotional reaction, but we do have tools that help us manage it and allow it to run its course. And watching your emotional reaction run its course, because we tend to think of these things when we have an emotional reaction as very tight, right? And very
Mhm.
solid. And watching it run its course over and over and over again is one of the best ways for that to loosen up and for us to start to see, oh, wow, that emotion was made up of all sorts of parts and pieces that are interconnected and constantly changing. And when we start to see the application in the small things we do every day of multiplicity, interdependence, and change, that is a real game changer. That's
Mm.
when we can easily and viscerally stop holding on things so tightly, or recognize when we are, and start to see there's a looser, more water-like quality that flows through this.
So speaking of emotional reactions, it's a good time to discuss that particular topic because, of course, at least here in the US, we are in the midst of this incredibly intense politically divisive season and era. And I'm sure in many other countries, even for those who are watching who are in other places, this is playing out in so many countries around the world where politics and the political climate is always intense at times, but it feels like we're at some other level right now. So I'm curious what your thoughts are when this is playing out and the stakes are so high. It's not just, we got upset in a personal relationship. These are real choices that affect us as a species, not even in a given country. It's things like climate change and the world economy and all sorts of things that are, have a real impact on people's lives. And yet, we're in the middle of it at a personal level in our conversations and relationships. We're constantly barraged with information from the media, which is just triggering these reactions and strong emotions. So how can we bring some of these perspectives and some of these golden threads and wisdom traditions, which, as you said, that we don't need to make this stuff up. People have figured this out over centuries and millennia. How can this help us in these incredibly challenging times?
Well, I think that is the question that's up for a lot of people. And for me, I know that you live in the Midwest. I tend to live more on one or the other coast.
Hmm.
But I just came back from the Midwest where I was there visiting some family um, just before the election. And I was there for a week, 10 days, something like that. And I was struck for the first time of going through Paw, Michigan, where I come from, and seeing that the yard signs, it's a largely Republican area, and that
Hmm.
the yard signs were not entirely for Republican candidates. They really were a Republican candidate, a Democratic candidate, a Republican. It was one after, it was that closely divided in what is
Hmm.
rural Michigan, or largely rural Michigan. So that really struck me, just in how divided we are and how closely divided we are, and how many of our neighbors may be holding beliefs that are so different from ours, but they're not talking about them and they're not putting out yard signs. So I do think it's extremely important, and it's very helpful viewed in that context, or at least it was for me and for my family, um, because my family came out with me. And my kids are grown, and my son was saying how struck he was that how this was, there was a death in the family, so there was a community event, and my brother-in-law, huge number of people came out for him. It was a wonderful outpouring, and sad one after his passing. And my son commented on how amazing it was that just by looking at the yard signs, it was pretty much 50-50,
Hmm.
yet everybody was coming together and all of that. So I do think that kind of perspective, that we are not as divided as we seem, and that we have more in common than we have as differences, is extremely important. And that's why the idea of looking at these as golden threads, and as threads that weave through many, if not all, the wisdom traditions, they might have a little bit of a flavor to them, can be helpful, because we're not coming at it as, one particular tradition and this is how we think, but we're looking again at the commonalities and
Hmm.
how much more we have in common than we have as differences. The other thing that I think, you know, and we've talked about this a lot, Court, the thing that I have found that practice really over the years, and now it's been decades, has instilled in me on a very deep level, and I've seen this transformation in people I've worked with in my meditation buddies, is this deep sense of intellectual humility, this
Mm,
sense that we can never really know what's going to happen next. And one of my favorite stories that I tell teaching and is the one about the farmer, the son, and the horse, which I'm sure you know. It's like
mm,
there's a farmer, there's a son, there's a horse. The horse runs away. The neighbor comes over and says, "Oh my goodness, this is terrible." And the farmer says, "We'll see," right? And this goes on when the horse comes back and brings another horse, and the neighbor says, "This is fabulous," and the farmer says, "We'll see."
mm,
And then the son is trying to train the horse and falls off and breaks his leg, and the neighbor says, "Oh, this is terrible, we'll see." And finally there's a war breaks out, and all young men are drafted, and the son is left back because of his injury. And when the neighbor says, "Congratulations," of course, the farmer replies, "We'll see."
mm.
And that story has really become kind of a shorthand for me and many of the people I work with and my family for we really never know what's going to happen next. And so, kind of coming at this with an open mind, looking at commonalities. And those are the things that I have found helpful in this time that is scary for me too.
I'm so glad you brought up humility. It's a topic that's been coming up in a lot of conversations that I've been having these days because of course with all the and especially with all the political discourse, humility is probably at record level lows. It feels like we're all so sure that we have a monopoly on the truth, that we've got to figure it out. The other side, is totally deluded. But it's interesting that every side is quite certain that it's the other side that has it all wrong. And there's also very interesting research that just shows that regardless of where you are, on which side of the spectrum you are, whether it's your political beliefs, religious beliefs, really any belief system, the more strongly you hold those beliefs, the more likely you are to screen out any information that conflicts with those beliefs. Basically, we cherry pick the things that confirm our beliefs, and if it doesn't align with what we think, we tend to just screen it out and ignore it. In some cases, we even hold on to our beliefs even more strongly when somebody presents us with conflicting information. So our impulses and our kind of instinctual reactions in times like this, when emotions are running high, are often the opposite of humility. We kind of lock into and contract around our beliefs. So I'm curious about this idea, building on what you just shared, of humility as a practice. I think we tend to think about humility, it's just something people kind of are humble or they're not, or we are humble or we're not. It's just something you either have or do not. But a word you've used repeatedly in our conversation today is practice. That even being human, we could just view as a practice. And all of these golden threads, like humility, are practices. So how would yeah, how could we think of it that way? Like what does humility as a practice actually look like? What does that mean in everyday life?
Well, I think two things come to mind. And one is sort of a reframing of the idea of humility, because often people think of humility as something less than, it's, oh, I'm humble. That means even if you use one of these programs like Grammarly or something, they will often tell you to sound more confident if you put in a word like perhaps or might or I think, not good. You have to sound very confident. So
Mm,
there's a sense of less than with the idea of being humble. And among some, not among, often not among practitioners, but among some, and trying to reframe that to be, oh, wow, the idea of intellectual humility, once you internalize it, it is such a relief, to be relieved of the pressure of having to know, of
mm,
having to know everything, of being absolutely sure when you're able to, again, that's one of those things that gets very, very tight. And so when we're able to loosen our grasp a little bit around that and go, okay, I've got a pretty good educated guess here what's going on, but it is limited by what I can actually know. And when the bats out in the night sky can navigate in ways that I could not possibly because of certain sensory systems that they have, and the dog next door can hear things I can't hear, and the bee that is getting pollen off of the flowers can pick up something off of those flowers that I can't sense. Those types of real world realities remind me of the limitations of what I can know.
Hmm.
And that to me is an incredible relief. And it's also a call to action. And so the relief is okay, I don't need to know everything. I don't need to feel that I have to know. And the call to action is to start to integrate that into everyday life. So just like we were talking before about how, and we didn't use the word negativity bias, but the idea of with a negativity bias, when we're focused on a narrow thing that's scaring us. And so we don't ignore what it is that's scaring us, but we also broaden our perspective to include the good. When we're starting to have a reaction to something that we are quite sure is not aligned with what our belief is or our perspective is, we certainly recognize that. We don't give up our own long held, deeply researched beliefs, but we expand our perspective to include what are a few things that might be going on here that could change my perspective or that could have influenced this perspective. And that opens up an opportunity for listening, for learning, for non-reaction, and for connecting. And I do think that right now, in such a polarized time, that the importance of interpersonal connection and meeting people and places and things with a sense of kindness and compassion and openness, that is how shifts have the potential to happen. Because when we start to connect with people, listen to them, help them feel seen and heard, then both of our guards go down, and then perhaps some conversation can happen. So those are my general thoughts. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree, and it makes me think about this shift that happens when we start doing these practices and we begin this inner journey of exploring these qualities that first, I think what happens probably for a lot of people is the way we see ourselves begins to shift a little bit. You know, for example, when I first started meditating, had a ton of anxiety. I had a phobia of public speaking, so things like this completely freaked me out. And I had this experience of this contraction when I would feel anxious. It's as though that's all I was seeing about myself in the world. It was just like the world and my sense of self had contracted to this just very narrow band of fearful, anxious, kind of tight, rigid thinking. And you start to see when you meditate, I can start to bring awareness exactly as you said earlier. I can start noticing, oh, there's all these things happening in my body. I can see this loop of thoughts that's playing out in my mind. And right away, or right then, it's almost as though that contraction loosens up and expands a bit. And then even beyond that, you can start seeing even when I'm experiencing anxiety, there are still these threads of kindness, these threads of awareness, these threads of insight and wisdom that are actually there, but we just don't see them when the contraction happens. But then the cool thing is that you can start seeing that in other people. So like in a moment like this, when you're arguing with somebody or you see somebody in the media who's, spouting off some view that triggers, your own reactions, you can see them a little differently too. It's not that you have to agree with them, but you can also see that, they're not just that view. They're this rich, beautiful human being. And there might be this part where you really disagree. But as you said earlier, there's so much more in common. And there's all this beauty and richness, even to the people we vehemently disagree with. So you both can disagree. It's not as though you ignore the stuff where there might be a real discussion to be had, but we just see so much more of ourselves and so much more of each other. And that becomes the practice, how to stay in that wider scope rather than just endlessly contracting into the narrowest band of our emotional reactivity.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we start by focusing on what we have in common, where we build the relationship and start the conversation there, that commonality, that then allows for kind of a lowering the shoulders, some trust to happen, that
Mm.
then it's the idea of talking about the differences that becomes more accessible. That conversation is more accessible once this trust and sense of commonality is built. But you mentioned something, Court, that I really want to underscore, and I'm curious what you think about, which is this idea of intuition.
Mm.
And I think that idea of intuition also kind of dovetails with the idea of prayer, which when you're talking about golden threads that cross across universal traditions, the idea of prayer, there is prayer in Buddhism, of course, but the
Mhm.
idea of prayer, Christian prayer, other sorts of prayer, that's where I hear a lot of questions. And what I loved that you were just talking about that I think ties into that is this idea of when you're able to get out of this kind of narrow, survival driven, tight response into something more open, what you're leaving room for is intuition for to emerge, right? All of
Mhm.
a sudden there's some space for these intuitions to emerge. And through that, that might be where there's some way of talking to people about some overlap or some commonalities, again, among
Mhm.
all of the different traditions, because there is, especially in the United States right now, there is an element of different traditions seeing things differently that is causing some of the sense of people being caught in their own silos.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Intuition's a fascinating topic. I had a researcher who reached out to me recently who's doing, I think, PhD work on the topic of intuition, and he wanted to talk about some of the research we do at UW-Madison, and so we had a whole conversation about it. And it's fascinating because it's a lot. I mean, it really underscores exactly what you've been saying in many different ways today, which is just this quality of opening up to experience and bringing the sense of kind of playful curiosity. And what that does is not only experientially we open up, but it's changing what's going on in the brain. So as I mentioned earlier, the if you get in a heated discussion, for example, or really any moment of emotional reactivity where that contraction happens, often what's happening in those moments is that it's certain networks in the brain, oftentimes the ruminative thoughts and emotional centers, they're on overdrive, and the parts of the brain that are taking in open to and taking in sensory information, for example, begin to deactivate. And so it's almost as though even though we're talking to somebody, we're really just talking to ourselves. You have two people who are sitting across the table arguing with each other, but in both cases you're kind of locked in your own little world.
That
But when
makes a
you
lot of
do,
sense to me.
yeah, exactly. I mean, that's, you
Yeah.
know, it's kind of funny, but that's even at a biological level, that's what's happening. But as you're saying, as you open up, you're basically opening all the channels to all of that rich flow of information. So you see the person in front of you, you really take in the gestures, you can see their facial expressions, you can cue into the hunched shoulders and whatever else that's going on, everything else in the environment. And the intuition is that we're processing so much information that is below the level of conscious experience. And
Mhm.
that can then bubble up. When we open up those channels, we can have a more intuitive response simply because we've opened all the channels to let all that experience in. And then that can bubble up to a more intuitive response that's not like some cognitive thing that we had to think about, but it's simply because we just opened things up. We simply took that contraction and expanded it, and then all the information can start flowing again. Whereas in the moment before, we kind of locked it down through that inner tightening. So yeah, I mean, as a practice, you can see how this is so helpful in relationships,
Mm.
really in any moment in life where it's just these little moments of, like you're kind of saying, it's just little moments of awakening where you suddenly wake up to experience versus shutting down. It's such an
Yes,
interesting
yeah.
process.
I love that. And I love it because it also really keys into one of these golden threads or universal themes, which is this idea of mystery
Mm.
or even magic a little bit, right? The ordinary magic that we have in everyday life. I mean, when we're able to kind of open up and let go, and then our ego tends to drop away. And when our ego tends to drop away, it leaves room for a experience, not a conceptual experience as much as a visceral experience of something where we really sense, wow, we're part of something far greater. than maybe we can even imagine. So this idea of intuition that you're talking about really, I think, does dovetail into this idea of ordinary magic and mystery, and
Hmm.
that sense of that there is something kind of something magical and mysterious that can go on, can actually put a smile on people's face, can bring us more to effortless flow, can bring us more to playfulness without turning into some California woo-woo thing. And since I'm calling you from California, I'm very sensitive to the idea of people like, oh, this is California woo-woo, but it doesn't need to be. It doesn't
Yeah.
need to be.
So you came from such an improbable background to some of these themes, the
Yeah.
playfulness, the curiosity, the sense of wonder, and working with children and families and parents. You were a high-powered lawyer in the entertainment industry. I mean, I can hardly imagine a more pressure cooker, intense professional environment. I mean, that must have been so intense. And putting, mediating business deals and lots of probably big egos in the room. How did you even get in this track? I mean, did it start did you bring that into your life then, or was it more like you needed something else? Yeah, I mean, what is it that led you to this, coming from this high-powered world you were part of?
Well, I was in entertainment, but I was in owned and operated radio and television stations, which is like a kind of wonderful niche environment that
Mm.
doesn't really exist in the same way anymore because of the advent of computers, unfortunately. But I loved being a lawyer. I'm not one of those people who hated it. And I honestly, some of the most mindful people I know were great lawyers. I mean, they just
Mm.
embodied a lot of this open-mindedness and less reactivity. Um, but yeah, I was always a seeker, like even from high school and that sort of thing. From the First Presbyterian Church of Paw, Michigan, that kind of stuff. I was one of the lucky ones who had these senses in church of some kind of connection to something greater than myself. So I was
Mm.
always yearning for that. But when I had young kids and was practicing law, I just needed help. I was so stressed out, and I found Tibetan Buddhism and a fabulous teacher who was here in Los Angeles at the time, Ken McLeod. And I was fortunate because at that time he was working with people. And so I was working with him. And then I've got two kids, one's now 30 and one's 33. Actually, he just turned 31. And my 31-year-old was, a little on the less regulated side of the attention spectrum. And you know what that's like when, your kid's school at 3 tells you that. And then there's also, they have you see specialists and everything. And I thought,
Mm.
hey, the practices I'm doing are really about attention. Let me see if I can adapt them. So I was at that point doing a practice with Ken where I had to put in a couple hours in the morning, and so I was getting up early, and I was working with an eye, focusing on one thing, and I had a cushion, and my son at 3 started toddling in, because
Mm.
I was in the bedroom next to where he was, and I thought, oh, this is a Buddha. I mean, he's definitely is like a reincarnate something, because I didn't at that point realize that he was coming in to see his mom, and it
Yeah.
was just he was trying to connect with me. So there was nothing out at that point about children's meditation. So I got a little cushion, I got a rubber duck, I got a rubber frog, and he would come in, sit on the cushion, stare at the frog or duck, and then in a few minutes, like tip over and fall asleep. And that's how I got started. And that was it. And then one thing led to another. And instead of doing pro bono activities for law, I started volunteering at the Boys and Girls Club and in some public schools. And that's how it all got started.
That's it. Well, thank you so much as one of the beneficiaries of all the work you did, and eventually the fact that you wrote The Mindful Child. And yeah, that was such a helpful support for me. It gave me so many ideas when my son was young, especially. I mean, it was a huge shift in my own life, as I'm sure it was for you. I had been my son was born when I was living in Kathmandu, and I was doing all these retreats, super, intensely invested in my meditation practice, and then suddenly had this little being, that I had to care for, and everything shifted overnight. And that's been the inspiration, I think, for a lot of the work that I've been involved with since, is just remembering that shift. And what is this practice now when I'm up at 3 a.m. and I've got a little sentient being on my shoulder that I love deeply, but I'm not going to sit down and meditate for an hour. Suddenly I have to completely reformulate. And I think, like, having read your book and got a lot of ideas, experimenting with that kind of. I remember, for me, I had been meditating. I had this room where both my office and my meditation spot were in the same room. And I would go in there, I'd meditate, I'd close my door. And then I realized he was never seeing me meditate. I was kind of just closing him off. He didn't even know I was doing it. And so I started opening my door. And then I even went further, and I thought, why don't I have a meditation session when, after I read him his bedtime story at night, I'll just sit on the foot of his bed and do a little meditation practice, and he can just see me. Like, I don't even need to do anything.
Yeah.
And I noticed all these amazing things started happening from that. For example, I would breathe a little louder, just so he could hear me. And I noticed he would synchronize his breathing with mine, for example. Or I'd kind of say these little kind of baby kid prayers, like in kid language, but something, about compassion and being kind. And he would suddenly poke his head up and be like, "What's compassion?" And, he was suddenly, if I'd like probably tried to force him to meditate or something, he would have revolted. But anyways, it was so inspired, by everything I had learned from you. It was so helpful.
Well, I think what you're talking about is really important. If anybody is listening who has kids or anyone in their life that they would like to do a little translation for, and that's why formal practice is important. I think it's important for all of us to offer opportunities for people to get a taste of this without formal practice, but the formal practice you had was able to inform how to make these shifts in real time with the little person in front of you. So that idea of getting a few skills about and understanding about the developmental appropriateness of different things at different ages, getting a few tips of some mindful games and activities you can play, but
Mm.
then in trying them yourself, but then going with the flow and in bringing that sense of playfulness and fun into your introduction of practice to your kids. That's, I think, where I tend to see a lot of exciting growth.
It reminds me of we invited you to Minneapolis. I think actually this is the first time you and I actually met, which,
Yeah.
when was that? 2010, 2011? Must have been
Around there. Yeah.
somewhere around there.
It was the first year that Rinpoche had just left for his 4-year retreat.
Okay, so that must have been 2011. That's right. I think it was you were maybe the first teacher we invited to the Tergar group in Minneapolis. And I still remember we had like these big balls. We were like,
Yeah.
and I remember at the beginning, I'm like, oh my God, I'm back in third grade. And then it was actually so helpful and profound because it just loosened up the whole process. Suddenly, meditation wasn't this like intense, serious thing. We're like
Yeah.
literally playing. And then
Yeah.
suddenly we're sitting and meditating, and you're dropping these really profound ideas on us. But there was an openness because of the playfulness and that sense of lightness that the play dissolved. So I just realized we've got a bunch of really, really great questions. So maybe I could drop a few of the questions that are coming in through YouTube and some of the people who are listening here. So the first one is, uh, hello, do you have an online meditation group or would like to do such a thing in the near future? And maybe I'll kind of drop in an addition, like, what's
Yeah.
the easiest way for people to connect with you and kind of stay up to date about what you're doing? How can people learn more about everything you've got going?
The easiest way to connect is through just my website, susankaisergreenland.com. And on that, there are a ton of pre-recorded videos and guided meditations and resources. And it is divided or organized by for educators, for parents, for adults, for kids. So that's the easiest way, and that will get you to everything else. Currently, I don't have an online meditation group going. I have had those in the past, but it is something I'm considering in the future.
Okay,
But
that's
thank you
great.
for that question. That's very thoughtful.
And for so I also on the website, you can sign up for Susan's email list. I'm on your email list as you well, why would you know that? But I am. And I get
Well,
those
thank you.
it's one of the newsletters that I really enjoy getting. So I would highly, highly recommend signing up for Susan's email list. My guess is the team is putting that in the chat on YouTube. So maybe we can put that up there if it's not already there. But I'd highly recommend signing up for Susan's email list. Another plug for the book. This is an amazing book. You should definitely pick that up. Incredibly profound and helpful. So there's another question that it's very much in line with a lot of the work that you've been involved with. So one of the viewers writes, I am convinced that one of the most important things that needs to happen to really change the world is to introduce these teachings massively at schools. Why do you think it is being so difficult to do it? And do you think it will be achieved in the next 10 years?
Oh, wow, that is a great question. And I think we have made huge, huge strides into the introduction of these ideas into schools. When I started going into schools, honestly, we couldn't say the word mindfulness. We couldn't say the word meditation. And, I remember one place that I went to do a little class in gardening because they had some raised bed gardens, and we did a little bit of breathing while we were gardening just as a way of trying to get these ideas in. I think the key to getting these ideas into schools is to start with the idea of nervous system regulation, nervous system 101, and tying that into some of this excellent research the court has been talking about. I think everybody, across the lifespan could really benefit from having a shorthand understanding of how our nervous system works and the effect of overly feeling overly excited or upset on our capacity to think clearly and to think widely and to listen. So I think that's really key, and there's more of that going into schools. One of the tricky things about bringing this into schools widely is the idea of training trainers. And this is where things can be a little bit tricky, because on the one hand, there are a lot of mindful games and activities that teachers with absolutely no experience in meditation can drop into their classroom and that are actually beneficial and that they start to see results immediately.
Mhm.
However, there are also ideas that come from actual practice and from working with kids and adults over a period of time that you really cannot pick up in a weekend workshop. And so this is one of the barriers for people like me in bringing this type of work widely into schools. Like immediately. I'm very excited about things like the Anytime Anywhere program that Tergar is now doing, because they do this I don't know if we call it hard work, but this meaningful work that requires significant effort to
Mhm.
train trainers in the underlying principles of meditation. And then once you have that, then in a relatively short period of time, figuring out how to bring those practices to kids can be accomplished. So, but all that said, I'm very optimistic. When I see how much change has happened just in the 20 years that I've been doing this, I am very, very optimistic about what the future is going to bring.
That's so helpful. So let's see, maybe one more question. I understand that intuition is an expression of wisdom quality of our mind. How do these two concepts of intuition and wisdom relate to each other?
Well, Court, I think that's right up your alley there as far as answering that question. I mean, I'm happy to chime in, but
No, I think they'd love to hear what you want to. What I think they probably hear too much from my thoughts on these things. What do you think?
well, wisdom, remember, I'm not a Buddhist scholar, so, and Court and I are very good friends, and it's very hard to hurt my feelings given my legal background. So, Court, jump in if I'm like getting this
No,
wrong.
please.
But I think intuition and wisdom are very, very closely aligned. And I think the idea we have, Rinpoche teaches this in every single time he teaches. We have in us our basic goodness, and that basic goodness are these innate human qualities that are inside us, one of which is wisdom. The others are attention, love, and compassion. And joy is a outgrowth, or is a is the effect of tapping into our innate qualities of awareness, love, and compassion, and wisdom. So that wisdom is inside of us all the time. But we teach kids through a game where we have all sorts of different scarves that, we have these jewels inside of us, but they get covered by different layers of thoughts, emotions, exhaustion. We're hungry, we're tired, conflict, all of that. And that makes it difficult to tap into those. So and that's also why playfulness and effortlessness is so important. When we're able to bring a light touch to our practice, when we're able to bring a light touch to what's actually happening in and around us, even if it's complicated or difficult, that playfulness, that effortlessness allows some of these layers that get in the way of our tapping into our natural goodness to ease. So that quality of intuition, when we have those intuitions bubble up, I think those intuitions are very often coming from these innate qualities of awareness, love, and compassion, and wisdom. And then, of course, we have to apply some critical thinking to these intuitions, some discernment to these intuitions. That's a different layer. But the first piece, the intuitive piece, is just the plain old visceral experience of allowing this thing to arise and then noticing it in the concept. How'd I do, Court?
I'm in no position to grade you, Susan, but that was a beautiful, beautiful response. So maybe we could just end with a question that came in from our team behind the scenes, which I really, really loved and is a great way to round things out here, which is, what is one tip that you'd like to leave us with that can help us to discover these moments of ordinary magic that are hiding in our everyday life?
The one tip I'd have, I mean, we've talked about appreciation, and appreciation's a game changer, and that's also something Rinpoche teaches. So I think that's pretty well known. What my tip would be is to interrupt this ongoing flow of what we do and say every day. We can kind of get just in the stream and keep going, and we can even be cool, calm, and collected while we're doing it, but we're still a little bit on autopilot. So my encouragement would be to really make a point of dropping brief moments of awareness into the small and sometimes messy things that we do and say every day. And with that moment of awareness, then after we sense the settling, just kind of ask yourself, like, which one of these universal themes really might reframe the situation a little bit? Is it the idea of renunciation, letting go but not giving up, to borrow from Rinpoche? Is it the idea of allowing, which is also a little bit letting go without giving up? Is it the idea of kindness, compassion, open-mindedness, and just doing that even when you don't have to? Just interrupting your regular day to drop these moments of awareness in, which is a more visceral experience, and then include an aspect of analysis, which is like a kind of a question, what really would change the situation, broaden it a little bit, which one of these universal themes or golden threads?
That is so precious. Well, Susan, this has been a real treat. I know on behalf of everybody here who is watching, and certainly the whole Tergar team, we are really honored and blessed that you took some time out of your busy schedule to be with us. And I think more than that, you are a true pioneer, one of these people who has opened up these ancient teachings in a whole area of our world and society that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise. And being a pioneer always sounds good, probably when it's happening to other people, but it's hard work, right? There's no path that people have laid out. So we are all so grateful that you did that pioneering work and have done so tirelessly work to bring these teachings and practices to so many, including us. So again, thank you for joining us. I think Beth is going to come back on here, but on behalf of everybody, Susan, thank you so much for being here today. Really, really
Well,
appreciate
thank you guys. I really appreciate it. And it is truly an honor for me to be on this. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cortland and Susan. Thank you so much for sharing your story. That was wonderful. I just want to add that at tergar.org, our website, if you go to the communities page, you'll see that there's a section of special interest groups. And one of our special interest groups is the parents and grandparents group. And a lot of the material that they use and work with was developed with Susan. So you can check that out at tergar.org on the communities page. And I actually have a few more announcements to make to share some of the things that Tergar is working on and making available. So first of all, if you're new to meditation, or even if you have been practicing for some time, but you want to deepen your meditation practice, then the Joy of Living program is a great place to start. These teachings offer a structured and authentic path designed by Mingyur Rinpoche, guiding you from the basics of awareness to profound insight into the nature of reality. Under the expert guidance of Mingyur Rinpoche, the Joy of Living contains 3 levels of teachings and methods to uncover our inherent awareness, compassion, and wisdom. You can see from the story that Evan told that these meditations have been really beneficial in my ability to express love toward others, even if in small ways. And as I've opened up more, my ability to be happy for others or grateful for others' freedom from suffering is slowly shifting my own worldview. And then along the way in the Joy of Living program, you'll connect with a warm and welcoming international community of fellow meditators. They can provide a sense of belonging and support that can be motivating, especially when beginning a new meditation habit or when maintaining a practice becomes a challenge. An additional unique benefit of being a Joy of Living subscriber is the ability to schedule one-on-one meetings with Tergar guides for expert guidance and to answer your questions. And this year, we started the Community Circle live sessions led by Tergar instructor Tim Olmsted. These interactive meetings aim to provide open and relaxed sessions where participants can share their experience and gain insights from Tim's expert guidance and from one another. And the next, and then a new feature that was launched this year is the new design. We made a bunch of optimizations for a better learning experience. And if you visit the website, joy.tergar.org, you will already see the new design. We're very excited about it. So we invite you to visit and start your journey now. You'll get a 10-day free trial if you want to sign up. And then now that you've learned about the Joy of Living, we're thrilled to invite you to a live half-day meditation workshop with Mingyur Rinpoche on November 30th, Meditation for Daily Life. In this online event, Rinpoche will offer practical guidance on how to integrate meditation into daily life. This is also a great opportunity to invite a friend to join you in exploring 3 essential skills for more peace in everyday life: presence, kindness, and curiosity. With live teachings and guided practices, we'll learn how to stay present, cultivate compassion, and deepen wisdom through curiosity. Register today at events.tergar.org. So with that, I would like to say one more time, thank you so much to Susan and to Cortland for your time today. And if you want to just turn on or unmute yourself and say goodbye and wave, and then thank you so much, everyone,
Thank you so
for
much,
joining.
everyone. Thank you again,
Thank
Susan.
you.
All right. Bye-bye. We'll see you the next time.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.